On an ordinary morning in the small, picturesque town of Brookfield, an unassuming woman named Clara went about her daily routine with practiced precision. Clara was the maid at the grand estate of Charles Vanderhoff, a billionaire whose wealth was well known in the town, but whose personal life remained a mystery to most. She had worked for him for over 5 years, starting as a simple housekeeper and gradually being trusted with more responsibilities. The Vanderhoff mansion was a sprawling estate nestled on the outskirts of town, an imposing structure that reflected both its owner's wealth and his desire for privacy. Clara's job, while demanding, had become second nature to her. She had no particular aspirations beyond keeping the house immaculate, looking after the family, and living a quiet, predictable life. Clara wasn't used to the luxuries that surrounded her. The Vanderhoff mansion had marble floors, high ceilings adorned with intricate frescoes, and chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. But Clara never paid much attention to the grandeur. She was too busy with her tasks, scrubbing floors, dusting fine antiques, and preparing meals for the family. She had learned to keep her head down and stay out of the way. Charles Vanderhoff, the billionaire patriarch, was a distant figure, often preoccupied with his business dealings. Though he could occasionally be seen in the garden or at the dinner table, he rarely engaged with her, and she never felt the need to ask for more. He was a man of few words, and Clara had come to respect his quiet nature. The Vanderhoffs were not a large family. Charles had a wife, but she spent most of her time traveling for business and social events, leaving Clara to care for the home. Their daughter, Evelyn, was away at college, often returning only during the holidays. It was a peaceful existence for Clara, one that she had grown comfortable with. Yet, like any seemingly perfect setup, there were moments when things began to shift, when the subtle changes went unnoticed, except for Clara. She felt something was different about this particular morning. The air felt thicker, the silence louder. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that her life was about to take an unexpected turn. Clara had always been a quiet, introspective person, and although she didn't engage much with the Vanderhoffs outside of her duties, she had always been observant. She could see the subtle cracks in the perfect image that the Vanderhoffs projected. Charles, despite his wealth and status, was a man who seemed perpetually burdened, his face often clouded with something more than just work-related stress. Clara, with her quiet nature, never pushed him for answers, respecting his need for space. But she had noticed little things over time, moments where he seemed to be looking at her with an odd intensity, moments that had made her question if he was seeing her as more than just a maid. She pushed these thoughts aside, convincing herself they were just passing observations. Today, however, something was different. As Clara entered the large kitchen to prepare breakfast, she noticed that Charles had already arrived, sitting at the kitchen table, looking out the window with a distant expression. His presence was unusual for this time of day. He rarely ever spent time in the kitchen unless it was for a quick cup of coffee before rushing out for meetings. But today, he was here, sitting alone, his usually well-groomed appearance slightly disheveled. He didn't acknowledge her at first as she moved about the kitchen, but Clara could feel his eyes on her. It was as though he was studying her, and it made her uncomfortable. When Clara placed a tray of freshly baked croissants on the table in front of him, he finally spoke. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Clara, how long have you been working for me now?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on her. 5 years, Mr. Vanderhoff," Clara replied politely, but there was a nervous edge to her tone. She had never been one to engage in personal conversation with him, and the question felt out of place. He nodded slowly, as if processing the information. 5 years, he repeated quietly. "It's hard to believe. You've been a loyal employee." His eyes flicked toward her for the first time, and Clara caught the look. There was something in his eyes, a mix of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite place. Clara felt her heart race, unsure of what to say next. But she continued on with her work, focusing on the task at hand. For the rest of breakfast, there was an uncomfortable silence between them. When he finished his coffee, Charles stood up abruptly, his demeanor shifting back to the cold, distant billionaire she was used to. He left the room without another word, his departure as abrupt as his arrival. That morning, Clara could sense that something in the air had changed. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it. As the day wore on, the quiet tension in the mansion grew. Little did Clara know, this would be the beginning of a series of events that would forever alter the course of her life. By the end of the day, she would find herself standing at the edge of a life-altering decision, one that would push her to question everything she thought she knew about herself, about Charles Vanderhoff, and about the world she had so carefully kept at arm's length. The shock of what was to come would ripple through the entire town, leaving a lasting impact on all who were involved. The following days were filled with an unnerving tension that Clara couldn't shake. She went about her duties, as she always did, but the unease lingered in the back of her mind. Charles's unexpected behavior had unsettled her, and she began to notice his eyes lingering on her more often, a strange intensity in his gaze. She tried to brush it off, chalking it up to her imagination, but deep down, something told her that everything was about to change. The air seemed heavier, filled with an unspoken expectation. Clara couldn't ignore the sense of something simmering beneath the surface, like a storm waiting to break. And then, one afternoon, it happened. She had just finished dusting the grand library and was about to head to the kitchen when she heard the door open behind her. She turned to see Charles standing in the doorway, his face serious, his posture rigid. He looked different, haggard, almost. His usually neat attire was wrinkled, and there was a furrow in his brow that spoke of a deep internal conflict. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she said nothing, unsure of what to expect. "Clara," he began, his voice low and strained, "I need to talk to you. Now." Her stomach tightened, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. She nodded and followed him into the sitting room. Once they were alone, Charles turned to face her, his eyes piercing hers with an intensity that felt almost suffocating. Clara," he began, his words coming slowly, almost haltingly. "I know this is unexpected, but I've been thinking about something. You're pregnant." Clara froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of his words hit her. It was true, of course, she had recently discovered she was pregnant, but she hadn't told anyone yet. How did he know? She hadn't even shared the news with her closest friends, much less her employer. Her mind raced, but she struggled to find the right words. "Yes, Mr. Vanderhoff," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "I can't have this happen under my roof, Clara. You've been a good employee, but I have a reputation to uphold. The media, the public, they'll never let me hear the end of it." His words struck her like a slap across the face. She had never expected this. She had hoped that the news would be met with understanding or at least sympathy. But instead, Charles's reaction was cold and dismissive. He wasn't concerned about her well-being, her future, or the challenges she would face as a single mother. He was only concerned with how the situation would affect his own image. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave," he said, his tone final, almost businesslike. "I can't afford any distractions right now. You need to pack your things and go." Clara stood there, speechless, unable to fully process what was happening. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, and she felt as though she were falling into a void. She had always respected Charles's authority, had always done her best to fulfill her duties. But now, the very man who had trusted her with his home, his family, was showing her the door. It felt like a betrayal, and the pain of it cut deeper than she could have imagined. "Mr. Vanderhoff, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't ask for this. I'm not looking for sympathy, but I need a chance. I need support." But Charles's expression remained unchanged. There was no trace of the man who had once praised her work, no hint of the understanding that had once been there. He was cold, impersonal, his focus solely on his own reputation. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "This is final. You have to leave." With those words, Clara's world crumbled. She turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy with shock and disbelief. She hadn't even begun to process the enormity of the situation when she gathered her things. Her hands shook as she packed the few belongings she had into a small bag. The mansion, once her safe haven, now felt like a prison. Her heart ached as she walked through the grand halls, the very place she had once considered her home, now seeming distant and alien. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do next, but she knew one thing for sure: her life had just been torn apart. As she stepped out of the mansion and into the cold afternoon air, Clara felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She was alone now, with nothing but a small bag and a growing baby inside her. She had no family to turn to, no other job prospects, and nowhere to go. The town, which had always seemed so comforting, now felt suffocating. She had nothing left, but even as despair threatened to swallow her whole, a small spark of determination flickered inside her. She couldn't give up, not now. She was going to make it, for herself and for the child she carried. But first, she had to navigate the wreckage that Charles had left in his wake. Meanwhile, back in the mansion, Charles stood at the window, watching Clara walk away. For a brief moment, doubt crept into his mind. He had made the decision for the sake of his reputation, but something didn't feel right. The image of Clara, her face pale with shock and sadness, lingered in his mind. Was he really doing the right thing? But the thought was fleeting, quickly replaced by the nagging voice in his head, telling him that it was the only choice. After all, a man of his status couldn't afford to be seen as anything less than perfect. Clara was just a maid, a passing issue. But as she disappeared from view, something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't ignore. Was he truly ready to live with the consequences of this decision? And more importantly, was this really the end of the story? Clara's life, and the town's perception of the Vanderhoffs, was about to take a sharp turn. What Charles had thought would be a quick and easy solution to his problem was just the beginning of something much bigger, a ripple that would spread far beyond the walls of the Vanderhoff estate, leaving a lasting impact on all who the following days after Clara's abrupt departure from the Vanderhoff mansion were a blur of confusion and pain. With no other place to go, she took refuge in a small, modest apartment on the outskirts of town. It was nothing like the opulence of the mansion, but it was a roof over her head. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with peeling paint on the walls and a worn-out couch in the corner, but Clara was grateful for the solitude. For the first time in years, she was free from the demanding schedule and expectations of the Vanderhoffs, but that freedom came with a heavy price. Her thoughts constantly returned to the conversation with Charles. The coldness in his voice as he dismissed her haunted her. She couldn't understand how the man she had worked for all these years, the man she had respected, could be so heartless. The pain of being abandoned without a second thought was overwhelming, and it took every ounce of strength she had to keep going. Yet, with each passing day, her resolve grew. She was determined to make a life for herself, even if it meant starting over from scratch. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the situation settled in. Clara's pregnancy progressed, and with it, the harsh reality of her situation. She had no family to lean on for support, no friends to turn to. Her savings were running low, and the idea of finding another job in the small town seemed impossible. Her reputation as the Vanderhoff's maid meant little to anyone else in town, and no one seemed willing to offer her a helping hand. Every job she applied for was met with rejection. Her past association with the Vanderhoffs worked against her, and the stigma of being a single mother was something no one was willing to overlook. It wasn't just the lack of support that made things hard, but the isolation. Clara had spent so many years in the Vanderhoff mansion, serving others, being a shadow in their lives, that she had forgotten how to connect with people. Evelyn nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. I never thought it would either. My father, he's always been so focused on his image, his reputation. He doesn't understand the impact of his decisions, how they affect real people. You didn't deserve any of this, Clara. I just want you to know that. Clara's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. It felt almost surreal to hear Evelyn say these things, to know that someone from the Vanderhoff family actually cared. She had assumed that everyone in the mansion, including Evelyn, had turned their backs on her. But here was Evelyn, acknowledging the wrongs of her father, expressing remorse for something that was entirely out of her control. I'm just so scared, Clara admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know what to do anymore. I've been rejected by everyone, even the town. I can't go back to that mansion, and I have nothing here. What's the point of even trying? Evelyn reached across the table and took Clara's hand, her grip firm and comforting. You're not alone, Clara. I know it feels like it, but you're not. I'll help you. I'll do whatever I can to make things right. You deserve so much more than what you've been given. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Evelyn's words were a lifeline, a reminder that there were still people who cared, people who didn't see her as a failure or a burden. There was a chance for a new beginning, even if it seemed impossible at the moment. Little did Clara know, this meeting would spark a chain of events that would change everything. Evelyn's decision to step forward, to help Clara in her time of need, would not only alter Clara's life but would also force Charles Vanderhoff to confront the consequences of his actions. As much as he tried to bury his regret, the ripple effect of his decision would come crashing back at him, forcing him to face the fallout of what he had done. And this time, it wasn't just his reputation on the line, it was something far more important. The days that followed Evelyn's visit marked a pivotal shift in Clara's life. She had not expected Evelyn to come to her aid, and as her words of support echoed in Clara's mind, a sense of determination began to take root. There was hope, however small, that perhaps things could be different. But the road ahead was anything but easy. Clara's mind swirled with uncertainty, and while Evelyn's promise to help gave her some comfort, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn stayed true to her word. She helped Clara find work, small jobs that allowed her to make ends meet, but it wasn't the financial support that Clara needed the most, it was the emotional stability, the steady hand that Evelyn offered, guiding her through the darkest days. But Clara still had moments of doubt, of fear. The weight of being an unwed mother, the stigma of her situation, continued to bear down on her, even as she found some measure of relief in Evelyn's presence. As Clara's pregnancy neared its final months, things began to take a turn in the small town of Brookfield. Word of her being pregnant and cast out by the Vanderhoffs had spread quickly, and the community, which had once looked down on her, began to stir. At first, the gossip was cruel, whispers behind her back, stares that followed her down the street, but gradually, something unexpected began to happen. Clara noticed that people began to offer small gestures of kindness. A neighbor offered her an old crib, a woman from the bakery gave her free pastries when she came in, and the town's doctor gave her a discount on her medical visits, a rare act of generosity in a town where appearances were everything. It was as though the town, for all its judgment and its tight-knit gossip, was beginning to soften. Clara was no longer just the maid, she was a woman, struggling against the odds, and somehow, that made people look at her differently. But not everyone was moved by Clara's plight. Charles Vanderhoff, despite the nagging voice in his mind telling him he had made a mistake, continued to live his life as though nothing had changed. He maintained the same icy composure, consumed by the demands of his business and social status. Every so often, Evelyn would bring up Clara's situation, but her father would wave her off, dismissing any concern for Clara's well-being. She's no longer my problem, he would say, his tone cold and indifferent. But as time went on, that coldness began to crack. Evelyn could see it in his eyes, the guilt, the realization that his actions had repercussions he couldn't simply ignore. The image of Clara leaving the mansion, her heartbroken face, haunted him at night. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him, as though he had betrayed her trust in the most unforgivable way. Yet, despite this growing remorse, Charles remained paralyzed. He had made his decision, and while a part of him wanted to reach out to Clara, to offer her help, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Pride, arrogance, and fear of what it would mean for his reputation kept him locked in a prison of his own making. He couldn't risk losing everything he had built, not even for the woman he had wronged. But deep down, he knew that his decision had irrevocably altered the course of his life, and no amount of business success or social accolades could erase the fact that he had abandoned someone who had trusted him. As Clara's due date grew closer, the truth about the man who had cast her aside was becoming impossible to ignore. The community, once quick to gossip and judge, began to see Charles Vanderhoff for what he truly was, a man too proud, too consumed by his own desires, to understand the lives he affected. And Clara, for all the pain she had endured, had become a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. Her refusal to let her circumstances define her, her ability to keep going despite everything, had earned her the respect of people who had once turned their backs on her. It wasn't an easy journey, but Clara had found a kind of peace in the quiet corners of Brookfield, and as the months passed, she began to embrace the idea that maybe, just maybe, she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The night Clara went into labor was unexpected. It came too quickly, too urgently. She hadn't prepared herself for the intense pain that swept over her, but there was no time to panic. Evelyn, who had become her steadfast support, was by her side in an instant. Together, they made their way to the small town hospital, where Clara was rushed into labor. The hours that followed were long, filled with pain and fear, but Clara's strength never faltered. She held on to the belief that no matter what, she would be okay. And when the cry of her newborn baby echoed through the sterile room, Clara's heart filled with something she had thought she had lost forever, hope. In the days that followed, as Clara recovered in the hospital, the world outside continued to move. Charles, who had spent so much time avoiding the consequences of his actions, was starting to realize that his life was no longer as perfect as it seemed. He couldn't avoid the truth any longer. The whispers of his neglect had reached every corner of the town, and his once impeccable reputation was beginning to crack. People had begun to question him, to wonder how he could abandon a woman who had been nothing but loyal to him. The community, once eager to uphold the Vanderhoff name, had started to pull away. His businesses weren't doing as well, his social events were filled with tension, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the sense that his past actions were coming back to haunt him. It wasn't until he heard that Clara had given birth to a healthy baby boy that something in him finally broke. The news hit him harder than he could have imagined. Clara, the woman he had cast aside, was now a mother, raising a child in the face of adversity, making a life for herself when he had shown her nothing but cruelty. He had created a fracture that could never be repaired, and it was only now, as he sat in his opulent office, staring out at the town below, that he realized how deeply he had failed her. Charles finally understood the gravity of what he had done, but the question remained, was it too late for redemption? Could he ever make things right, or had his actions forever destroyed any chance of reconciliation? As Clara looked down at her son in the quiet solitude of her hospital room, a sense of peace settled over her. She had been through hell and back, but she had survived. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. And perhaps, in time, the past would lose its power over her. But for now, she held her son close, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and Clara found herself settling into a new routine with her newborn son, who she named Samuel. The small apartment she had once dreaded now felt like a safe haven. With each passing day, she grew more confident in her ability to care for him, even without the luxury and support she had once taken for granted. There was a quiet strength in her now, a strength that hadn't been there before. Samuel's presence had changed everything. He was a reminder that, despite all the hardship, life could still be beautiful, still full of possibilities. The people of Brookfield, who had once whispered behind her back, now offered smiles and greetings as Clara walked down the street with her son in her arms. It was as if the town had begun to see her not as a castaway from the Vanderhoff family, but as a mother doing what was best for her child. Even those who had been the loudest in their judgment began to soften. Clara noticed how they would approach her in the grocery store, asking how she was, offering advice, and even telling her how brave they thought she was. The distance between her and the community seemed to be narrowing, piece by piece. Yet, despite the changing atmosphere, Clara still held a quiet sadness deep within her. She had found peace in her life, but there was a part of her that couldn't forget what had happened, the coldness of Charles's dismissal, the way he had cast her aside without a second thought. No amount of kindness from the townspeople could erase that. She knew that, for her own healing, she needed to face the man who had caused her so much pain. One chilly afternoon, as Clara pushed Samuel's stroller through the park, a familiar black car pulled up beside her. She barely had time to register it before the driver's side window rolled down. It was Charles. His usually confident, imposing demeanor was absent. His face, once so controlled, now looked tired, older, as though the weight of his decisions had finally begun to take its toll on him. "Clara," Charles said, his voice quieter than she remembered. "Can we talk?" Clara stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The sight of him stirred old feelings, anger, betrayal, confusion, but there was something else now, something she hadn't expected, pity. Charles looked different. Gone was the arrogant businessman who had once ruled the town with an iron fist. The man standing before her seemed vulnerable, like someone who had been broken by the weight of their own choices. "What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice guarded. She couldn't believe he had the audacity to show up now, after all this time. "I've made a terrible mistake," Charles said, his eyes meeting hers with an earnestness that was unfamiliar. "I've thought about nothing but my reputation, my wealth, and I completely disregarded you. I threw you out of my life without considering how it would affect you. How it would affect Samuel. I didn't want to come here, but I couldn't live with myself any longer. Please, let me make amends." Clara was silent for a long moment, the words he spoke hanging in the air between them. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, but the wounds were still fresh. The pain of losing everything she had known, the betrayal that ran so deep, was not something she could simply forget. Samuel, sensing the tension, cooed in his stroller, and Clara looked down at him. He was her world now, the only thing that mattered. "Making amends?" Clara echoed, the bitterness creeping into her voice. "How can you make amends for something like that, Charles? You didn't just fire me. You didn't just send me away. You took away everything I knew. You took away my dignity, my security, and my trust in people. And now, you want to fix it? You think a few words can undo everything?" Charles winced, his face contorting with the weight of her words. "I know it's not enough. I don't expect you to forgive me just like that. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I can't undo the past, but I can try to make things right from here on out. I want to help you, Clara. I owe you that much." Clara shook her head slowly, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. "Help me? By throwing money at the problem? By giving me what, more pity? No, Charles. I don't need your help. I don't need you to fix things. I've learned to live without you. I've learned to take care of myself and my son, without your name or your wealth. I don't want your charity." Charles took a deep breath, clearly frustrated but understanding. "I'm not offering charity, Clara. I'm offering what you deserve, a chance to rebuild, to not have to struggle alone. I can help with the house, with the baby's future. Whatever you need, just tell me. Clara's eyes flashed with anger. I don't need anything from you, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I've already built a life, and I don't need you to come in and try to fix everything like it's some charity case. I don't need your pity. Charles looked down at his hands, his face heavy with regret. I was wrong, he admitted quietly. I was blinded by my pride, by my fear of losing everything. But I've lost something far more valuable in the process, my humanity. I've realized that no amount of money or success can replace what I lost when I treated you the way I did. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She didn't know what to think. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave and never come back. But another part of her, the part that still carried a little bit of hope, wanted to believe that he was truly sorry. That he could somehow make up for the damage he had caused. But the wounds ran so deep. How could she let someone back into her life who had so easily discarded her? I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Charles continued, his voice softening. But I hope, someday, you'll see that I am truly sorry for what I did. And maybe, in time, we can both find peace with it. Clara looked at him one last time, her heart torn. She wanted to hate him, to push him away and never think of him again, but something inside her knew that was not the way forward. I don't know if I can forgive you, Charles, she said quietly. But I will never forget what you did. As she turned to walk away, Samuel's soft coos broke the silence, pulling her focus back to what mattered most. Clara didn't need Charles to heal. She didn't need his money, his apologies, or his regrets. She had already found strength in herself, and in her son. She was building her own future, one that didn't depend on the Vanderhoffs or their wealth. It was hers and Samuel's, and that was enough. The encounter marked a turning point. Charles might never truly understand the depth of what he had done, but Clara knew she had moved on. The future was no longer bound by his actions. She was free, and nothing, not even the regrets of a billionaire, could take that away. Months passed, and Clara's life continued to transform. The town of Brookfield, once skeptical of her, had begun to embrace her. Her son Samuel had become a beloved figure in the community, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. Clara herself had gained a reputation as a strong, determined mother who had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged victorious. Despite the setbacks, Clara had learned to stand on her own 2 feet. She was no longer the maid who had been cast aside by the Vanderhoffs. She was Clara, a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. But while the town had forgiven her, the scars from the past still lingered. Clara had tried to move on, to focus on her son and the life she was building, but every now and then, the memory of her time with the Vanderhoffs would resurface. It wasn't just Charles's abandonment that hurt, it was the betrayal of trust, the way her entire existence had been erased in an instant. She had been disposable to them, someone who could be discarded when no longer useful. That was the hardest thing to forget. Charles, for all his attempts at redemption, had faded into the background of her life. After that tense encounter in the park, Clara had not seen him again. His presence had lingered for a while, like a shadow at the edge of her vision, but as the months passed, she came to terms with the fact that their paths would never cross again. And maybe that was for the best. Charles had offered his apologies, but Clara couldn't erase the years of hurt in a few moments of regret. There was no easy reconciliation. Some things, once broken, could not be fixed. Life had a funny way of moving forward, regardless of what had happened in the past. Clara had learned to accept that, and in doing so, she had allowed herself to heal. But she couldn't help but wonder about one thing: what would her life have been like if she had never met the Vanderhoffs? Would she have been happy working in a quiet corner of the world, far from the luxuries and dangers of wealth? Or had the life she had led, the choices she had made, somehow shaped her into the person she had become today? The answer, Clara realized, was complicated. Life wasn't as simple as a clean slate. She had learned so much from the mistakes, the pain, and the struggles she had faced. They had shaped her into the person she was now, strong, independent, and unafraid to fight for what she deserved. Samuel had become her reason for everything. Every decision she made, every move she took, was now centered around him. He was her world, and she would do anything to protect him, to give him a better future than the one she had been given. One evening, as Clara was walking home from the market with Samuel in tow, she noticed something she hadn't expected. A letter addressed to her, slipped under the door of her apartment. It was from Charles. For a moment, Clara hesitated. She had long since put him out of her mind, had decided that his actions no longer held power over her. But the curiosity, the need for closure, was too strong. She opened the letter, and as she read, the weight of his words hit her. Clara. I'm writing this not to ask for forgiveness, but to finally be honest with you. The past months have been the hardest of my life. I've had to face the truth of who I am and what I've done. I've spent so many years building an empire, but I never stopped to consider the lives I affected in the process. I thought I could control everything, but I couldn't control the consequences of my actions. You were right. You didn't need me to fix things. You've proven that. You've shown me what true strength looks like. I know now that my actions were unforgivable, and I don't expect anything from you. But I wanted you to know that I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you. I'll never be able to undo the past, but I hope you can find it in yourself to let go of the anger. I know that the road to healing isn't easy, and I've no right to ask for a place in your life. But I wanted to leave this letter as a step towards making things right, even if it's just for my own peace of mind. I wish you and Samuel all the best. Charles Vanderhoff. Clara folded the letter carefully, her heart a jumble of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was touched by the sincerity of Charles's words. On the other, it brought back the pain, the betrayal that had almost broken her. She had moved on from him, from his family, from the life she had once known. She had found her strength in the absence of their influence, and Samuel had become her anchor, her reason for everything. But in that moment, Clara realized that forgiveness wasn't about him, it was about her. She didn't need Charles's approval or his regret to find peace. She had already found it within herself. She stood up from the small table where she had been sitting, the weight of the letter still in her hands. The letter would remain in a drawer, a reminder of the past, but it wouldn't control her future. Clara had learned the hard way that life could never be neatly packaged. Sometimes, things didn't turn out the way we expected, and sometimes people would hurt us in ways we could never understand. But in the end, it was how we chose to move forward that truly mattered. The sun was setting as Clara looked out the window, her son resting peacefully in his crib. She had built a life that was hers. And that was all that mattered now. The future was hers to shape, and no amount of regret, no amount of mistakes from the past, could take that away. Samuel would grow up knowing love, knowing strength, and most importantly, knowing that he was worth more than anything that had ever tried to break his mother. And that, Clara realized, was the greatest victory of all.